everyone for taking the time to join this session. My name is Şansal. I use they them pronouns. If we were presenting in Turkish, I wouldn't need to mention this. Ironically and unironically, that is also part of the work that I'm doing in this research, titled Breaking the Binary Communication Experiences of Non-Binary Individuals in Turkey. Next slide, please. Okay. So over the next 15 minutes, I will walk you through the key aspects of my research. So next slide, please. Just to set the scene geographically, Turkey, as you can see, is located in the intersection of Europe and Asia. Next slide, please. And as we consider the broader background and context, Turkish law, through binary sex marker change as possible, considers individuals to be male or female according to sex on their birth certificate. This means that non-binary gender are not recognized in Turkish law. The law and legal actions in Turkey continue to complicate and negatively affect the lives of LGBTQ+ individuals, and these people are vulnerable to social isolation, physical abuse, and violence that may even escalate to acts of homicide and suicide. One of the new legal actions right now, a new penal code that is drafted, not passed yet, that tries to criminalize promotion of LGBTQ, which can, if it passes, include many activities such as same-sex performance of an engagement ceremony open in public. Last part of the context that I want to just emphasize, that Turkish is grammatically a gender-neutral language, which also includes there is no gendered pronouns, so there is only one pronoun, that is o, and that translates to he, she, it, they. Next slide, please. So my research question is, how do non-binary people, predominantly speaking Turkish and living in Turkey, try to communicate to other people that they are non-binary? This question is important because non-binary individuals are often underrepresented in academic and social research in Turkey, and my research seeks to contribute to the literature by exploring how a specific linguistic, cultural, and political context shapes the expression and understanding of gender through lived experiences. Next slide, please. So, of course, I'm going to quote my diary entry, which I almost wrote, I think, 10 years ago. So, this is really helpful to state my positionality. I quote from my diary that my coming out story, not right off the closet, this part was already in English and then originally in Turkish. I think this is an expression that has no Turkish equivalent, end quote. As a queer person growing up in Turkey, language played a significant role in my life and my coming out story. As a person who was middle class, who went to private schools and learned and studied in English, when the limited Turkish resources were becoming a roadblock, I was privileged enough to read in English and understand myself better. Next slide, please. Well, in this presentation for literature review, I will focus on only in Turkey for conciseness, which is actually very concise and short, so it will be very fast. Initiatives like Caste GL, which is one of the biggest and oldest LGBTQ organizations in Turkey, publish resources such as 2021 brochure prepared by Yıldız Star about non-binary people addressing the need to make their identities known. Also, as a side note, Yıldız Star right now is arrested a month ago and still in custody for their activism and journalism about LGBT people and Kurdish people in Turkey. And one of the first studies that was conducted specifically focusing on non-binary people's life experiences in Turkey was Ecem Toraman's 2024 work. In their thesis, Toraman delves into the identity development of non-binary individuals. And finally, I will want to include this one gender-inclusive language-focused article in Turkey. In Turkey, normally the literature is really focused about gender equality between men and women. This one study by Elena Nokius in 2022 showed how translators face significant challenges representing non-binary and trans identities in Turkish because of the linguistic differences, and this gap often erases non-binary visibility in media and translations. Next slide, please. My theoretical framework is basically symbolic interactionism and queer theory, while symbolic interactionism helps explore how individuals construct and communicate their gender identity through everyday social interactions. Queer theory critiques essentialist view of gender and sexuality, emphasizing their fluid and socially constructed nature. Next slide, please. My research employs a qualitative interpretive framework, focusing on understanding how non-binary individuals make sense of their experiences in Turkey, particularly using the Turkish language. The participants were self-identified non-binary individuals who predominantly used Turkish in their daily lives, were aged 18 to 32, and had recently lived in Turkey for at least 5 consecutive years. I did snowball sampling and recruit 13 participants, and we did online semi-structured interviews. I also used Brown and Clark's reflective thematic analysis for identifying patterns. Next slide, please. So we will deep dive on my findings. Here are my 3 themes and sub-themes in simplified table format. My first theme was characteristics of Turkish, my second was strategies and adaptations, and the third theme was communicating gender identity in various contexts. Here I have many points I would like to explain. My interviews were on average 1 hour and 40 minutes, and there are many rich examples of participant experiences of communicating their gender. With this said, for the sake of time, I will give you examples from my second and third theme today, and hope to open up other findings if you are wondering in the questions. Next slide, please. So my most surprising realization in the analysis process was realizing how participants were well aware of how language was echoing patriarchal, binary, cis-heteronormative structures. Also, some participants self-reflected on communication strategies. For example, in my first sub-theme, when talking about strategies for communication, Fikret called an online LGBTQ event in which they had participated in Turkey, and I quote, "Everyone announced their pronouns in English, and at some point we discussed the elitist aspect of it, because everyone whose native language is not Turkish already exists in this platform, and you know, they are already forced to speak Turkish due to kind of nationalism aspect, and on top of that, adding the elitist attitude to needing to know English," end quote. In this and other examples, participants' expression were very reflective about how their strategies to overcome binary gendered restrictions were also producing inequalities and different power dynamics between each other in communities especially. Next slide, please. Then there were the findings I anticipated, such as the difficulties and barriers to accessing healthcare under my sub-theme of tailoring the discussion. From the literature and my own experiences, I knew they would surface, even though I hadn't directly asked about them. Yet this does not lessen the profound and frustrating irony of hearing my participants describe how for much of their lives they had to pretend or hide in order to fit in. They spoke of joy and relief they felt in coming out, only to find themselves still having to lie or conceal parts of their identities in order to access gender-affirming healthcare. Even though the focus was on the medical institutions, communicating with their family was also really emphasized. For example, Indigo stated that, and I quote, "In the family, the reason why I recently came out to my father was because I wanted to start hormones. And you know, I couldn't come out as non-binary because I had to come out in an intelligible way in order to start hormones. Because non-binary is not intelligible to my boomer father," end quote. As we can conclude from this and many similar examples, participants' approach to coming out was highly adaptive and tailored to the context and people around them. Next slide, please. When I moved to the discussion, I saw that my findings complement and extend the existing literature. I will go over 4 discussion points today. Next slide, please. Participants' reflections about Turkish show that even though Turkish was grammatically available for gender-neutral and inclusive use, cementing and covert gender was very predominant in the language. This use can be understood by the dominant binary heteronormativity in society. Participants' descriptions of everyday examples showed a lot about language, including Lubunca, which is a queer slang mostly created and used by trans-identified people, which had a very binary-centric use still. This is parallel to the literature that highlights binary gendered use in Turkish, where adjectives, pronouns, and items can convey negative connotations about women. When it comes to the issues next slide, please. When it comes to the issues and overcoming these with verbal and nonverbal strategies to communicate their identities, participants develop many ways to make their gender identity understood. I categorized the main issues participants expressed with the concept of unintelligibility. They explained the lack of standardized and developed sexual orientation and gender identity vocabulary in Turkish. and societies lumping LGBTQ terms together. This language aspect, merging with no formal education and lack of mass media representation on gender and sexuality topics, contribute to unintelligibility of non-binary identities. Parallel with both Turkish and Anglophone literature, if one's identity is outside of the domain of cultural intelligibility, such as outside of established hegemonic masculinity and femininity, people's daily lives can be unrecognized and not represented by institutions like families, schools, healthcare providers, and media. The discourse of Western imitation and gender identity crisis were used frequently by political and religious figures in the media. This was an important contributor to non-binary people's marginalization in Turkey. Also, the lack of standardized, intelligible Turkish terminology about gender identity and sexuality-related topics and concepts contributed to this marginalization. Next slide, please. Finally, Goffman's analysis of impression management helps to understand non-binary people's strategic control of their gender identity expression and communication. Sometimes, non-binary people can come out spontaneously, taking the risk of backlash. With this said, main communication and coming out efforts were, according to participants, indicating that non-binary people were very selective about disclosing their gender identity, and when necessary, they were tailoring their discussion and disclosure. Their moves usually seem well thought and calculated to achieve authenticity while making sure that they minimize safety and exclusion concerns. These indicate that coming out is a continuous procedure and that is always in the corner of non-binary people's mind, embedded in their daily decisions, from their choice of clothing to everyday interactions with others. Finally, next slide, please. Looking at these strategies and context with intersectional lens, non-binary people have layered experiences in many aspects. Class dynamics, elitism, especially the need to know a certain degree of English, speaking a minority language, having feminist and non-binary identities, and other intersectionalities are among important factors determining the layered experience of communicating one's gender identity. Next slide, please. This discussion points is also helpful in contextualizing some of my limitations. My small sample unfortunately lacked diversity. My participant had high level of education, predominantly lived in big cities, and all spoke English except one of them. However, my analysis also shows that this is not surprising, since access to resources and LGBTQ organization, which often requires proficiency in English and higher educational levels, further contribute to limiting diversity of population who fits in my criteria in Turkey. Even using the term non-binary requires some level of knowing English and higher educational levels. Additionally, another limitation was I unfortunately had to exclude digital spaces. Next slide, please. Moving on to future studies, to gain more comprehensive perspective, studies can employ a diverse range of data collection methods, such as photo voice or different type of data collecting methods. Also, Turkish as a gender neutral language was promoting the use of Turkish as a gender neutral way to use promoting gender equality can further be investigated. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, before slide, I merged them.
Sorry.
Can you go back to
one? Go
yes,
back.
previous
Sorry,
slide.
here we go.
That is
That?
the previous one, yes. I want to say that investigating how non-binary individuals navigate and adapt language to express their identities contributes to a deeper understanding of intersection between language, gender, and culture. The findings suggest that in contexts where language is theoretically designed to be gender neutral, the interactions of gender identity communication reveal significant insights on how socialization influences individuals' language use, emphasizing the complex relationship between societal norms, personal identity, and linguistic expression. Finally, I hope that this research contributes to bridging the gap between academic inquiry and social activism by documenting how non-binary people communicate and express themselves. Through the dissemination of this work, like these conferences and more different printed form, I aim to encourage non-binary individuals by sharing their experiences and contributing to a knowledge base that advocates for awareness and change. Next slide, please. Here's my references. And thank you for listening to me. I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion.
Hello, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Kiran. My pronouns are they, them. And today we're going to be discussing gender, the state, crime, and ethnography in 19th century North India. Before I get started, I did want to give a brief trigger warning. We are going to be looking at the colonial terminology used to describe gender diverse people, which is extremely dehumanizing and can be upsetting. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves. Next slide, please. So by the mid-19th century, particularly after a major rebellion rocked North India in 1857, British colonial officials were terrified about their lack of knowledge on the people of India. It seemed increasingly vital to British officials to know Indians in order to shore up their own control of the colony. We therefore see an explosion of knowledge-making, including martial race handbooks, censuses, surveys, and ethnographies. Ethnographies, which we'll be focusing on today, were meant to index knowledge about Indians and were often written by British men relying on Indian assistants and informers. So these ethnographies tend to represent to us British and dominant caste Indian perspectives. Ethnographies are generally arranged by caste and allowed the colonial state to know the fundamental characteristics of Indians. Next slide, please. This knowledge-making process helped uncover the habitual criminals to British audiences. These were groups of people the British believed to be culturally or biologically criminal. One early example from the 1830s is Thuggi, where groups of Indians were thought to be culturally homicidal, while another example are the criminal tribes of the 1870s, who were thought to be hereditarily criminal. These ethnographies were an integral tool for the British state in its efforts to combat this habitual criminality. They listed each group as having timeless and permanent inherent qualities, which included occupation and propensity for criminality. So historian Mark Brown points out that these ethnographies allowed the state both to identify which groups were criminal and to figure out how to reform or eliminate them, and allowed police to identify someone as a member of a criminal group, even if they were disguised. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. One of the most direct attempts to address this habitual criminality in North India was the Criminal Tribes Act, or CTA, of 1871. Part 1 dealt with the eponymous criminal tribes, whom I've just mentioned. It provided for their forced resettlement, registration, and surveillance. Part 2 of the CTA, which has received much less scholarly attention, was a response to an ongoing moral panic about Hijras. Hijras are a community of people who deviated from British gender norms. According to colonial records, they performed in public in women's attire, they collected alms, particularly as part of birth rituals, and were generally assumed by the British to be eunuchs, habitual sodomites, and serial kidnappers. Part 2 of the CTA forced Hijras to register with the district magistrate every time they entered a district. It prohibited them from wearing women's clothes in public, and it banned them from having children in their households, along with a host of other restrictions. According to historian Jessica Hinchy, this was a concerted attempt to completely eliminate Hijras, resulting from officials' beliefs that Hijras were habitually criminal, in part due to their deviant gender performance. So the Northwest provinces, which are approximated on this map in blue, and Punjab, which is approximated in green, both implemented the CTA, but interestingly, only the Northwest provinces, or NWP, enforced the second anti-Hijra part. However, Hijras were certainly part of this wider criminalization project that I've described, again, because officials thought they were habitual sodomites, forcible kidnappers and castrators, and were attempting to eradicate Hijras in response. As you might imagine, some ethnographies therefore include entries on Hijras, allowing the state to make and collect knowledge about them and to police them. Next slide, please. By looking at these ethnographic entries, we can gain insight on the colonial state's approaches to Hijras. Officials situated them within wider discourses on caste, which complicate British definitions of caste, and also helped reinforce and naturalize hegemonic gender roles. However, intriguingly, these entries also reveal some ambiguities in how British officials perceived Hijra criminality, raising questions about the unity of the colonial state on issues of gender roles. They also help us understand some of how Hijras themselves might have navigated and evaded colonial criminalization attempts. Next slide, please. So today we'll be looking at two entries in particular. So the first is William Crook's The Tribes and Castes of the Northwestern Provinces in Awadh, which is published in 1896. This entry is focused on Hijras in the NWP, and it's very short. It's just about 2 paragraphs long. Crook tells us that Hijras beg, they play music, they dress in women's clothes, and that all Hijras become Muslim, but they do originate from a wide range of caste and religious backgrounds. The second ethnography is published about 15 years later. It's H.A. Rose's A Glossary of the Tribes and Castes of the Punjab and Northwest Frontier Province. Here, Rose is focused on Hijras in Punjab, and he gives us about 2.5 pages of information, so a lot more detail. However, kind of in the aggregate, he's reinforcing a lot of Crook's observations. He tells us Hijras dress in women's clothes and ornaments, they act in a feminine manner, they perform in public in ritual spaces, and they beg. He again tells us that all Hijras are or become Muslim, as well that all Hijras are or become impotent. But he does portray Hijras as a tight-knit community that people tend to stay in for life. Intriguingly, Rose also portrays Hijras as one of many groups challenging gender norms in colonial Punjab, but he doesn't actually tell us anything about these other groups, just that Hijras interacted with them, which is a little frustrating, but raises the possibility that this was a bit more widespread than perhaps the British were willing to admit. Next slide, please. So the types of information that Crook and Rose are choosing to include in these entries is really revealing of their purpose as part of this criminalization project. They spend a lot of time on Hijras' caste backgrounds, behavior, and more, all of which were vital for knowing, identifying, and policing Hijras. However, one of the most interesting choices they make is that both devote quite a bit of attention to Hijras' bodies and biology. So, as a brief aside, British notions of biology at this time tended to include things like anthropometry and phrenology. We're thinking calipers here. These were central to understandings of caste and race. Castes were thought to be completely endogamous because you didn't marry outside your caste, and so each one could be thought of as a different biological group. What this discourse did was it made the distinction between Indians and British seem natural, and it also allowed Indian elites to produce and maintain a distinction between themselves and marginalized castes or tribes. Returning to Hijras, we do see physical difference being a significant component of these ethnographic entries via extensive discussion both of their physical presentation and of their bodies. So Crook and Rose, as mentioned, tell us that Hijras wear feminine attire and women's ornaments. This marked Hijras out as visibly distinct from other groups. Only Hijras dress like this. It also portrays Hijras as a strictly bounded and easily identifiable group because all Hijras dress this way, and their gender performance becomes a fundamental quality of their kind of group membership. Their distinctive attire was in turn attributed to their biological difference. Crook and Rose tell us quite a bit about the ways in which Hijras' bodies were deviant, which they discuss variously as impotence, castration, or deformation. So Crook tells us that Hijras took deformed boys, implying that all Hijras were born with physical deformities. Rose, meanwhile, tells us that it appears to be a fact that eunuchs are permanently unsexed. What this discourse does is it, again, denotes Hijras as a biologically distinct group, even though they're not reproducing themselves in a normative manner. Heredity is not operating the same way that it is in other groups here. But just as castes were bound by notions of biology, Hijras are shown to share bodily characteristics that were inherently and biologically separate from all other Indians. Their deviant dress and gender presentation, in turn, becomes a fringe practice connected to their deviant bodies. This helped lessen the threat that Hijras pose to hegemonic gender norms. Gender is still a natural and immutable thing because only people with specific deviant bodies could, in fact, transgress these gender boundaries. Next slide, please. However, while, as I've mentioned, these ethnographies were certainly engaged in essentializing Hijras and were part of the ongoing criminalization project that was meant to completely eliminate them, Crook and Rose actually diverge a little bit on their portrayals of Hijras' crimes. Crook points out that the CTA was successfully eliminating Hijras in the NWP. Their numbers are gradually decreasing because of its operations. While Crook doesn't actually tell us anything about Hijras' specific crimes, this really implies to the reader that Hijras are criminal. After all, why else would the state be trying to eradicate them? However, Rose goes into a fair bit of detail about Hijras' behaviors and lives in Punjab, but never actually describes them as criminals. We see in the NWP next door, officials pretty much always mentioning Hijras in connection with these crimes, with kidnapping, with castrating children, with sodomy, with sex work, with other vices. Rose does mention castration in a footnote, but never frames it as non-consensual, and he doesn't mention kidnapping. He also mentions that Hijras dress and act like women, but doesn't link this to any mentions of sodomy, unnatural crime, vice, or sex work. In fact, he avoids mentioning crime altogether, thus implying that Hijras maybe aren't habitually criminal. We don't know what Rose's motivations were for portraying Hijras this way, but one possibility becomes kind of evident when we look at the operations of the CTA. Rose is focused on Punjab, where, as you'll recall, this part of the law was never actually enforced. Historians haven't investigated what Punjab officials thought about Hijras, so we don't know if they actually understood gender differently or they just were like, this is too expensive, we're not going to bother. But Rose is providing us with a potential clue. Maybe officials in Punjab didn't actually believe that Hijras were habitual criminals, so they didn't enforce Part 2 of the CTA, and Rose didn't use criminality as a way of understanding Hijras. Therefore, Rose and Crook inadvertently show us the possibility of deep fissures in North Indian views on Hijras. Next slide, please. These ethnographies are clearly revealing of officials' attitudes towards Hijras, but they're also revealing of Hijras' attitudes towards the colonial state. So agency can take quite a few different forms, and particularly in Rose's entry, because it's a bit longer, a few of them are apparent. Rose occasionally alludes to conversations or interviews with Hijras, indicating that at least some chose not to refuse this ethnographic process entirely. They were willing to provide information about themselves to colonial officials and/or their proxies. Yet in one instance, Rose mentions that Hijras flat refused to answer some of his questions. About a ritual meal, he tells us that, quote, the eunuchs themselves are reluctant to even mention its name. This seems to be an instance of Hijras resisting the state by refusing to engage with the ethnographic process entirely. They kept some information away from the state, even though the state wanted to have it. We can also see Hijras resisting the frames and narratives that colonial officials tended to use to describe them. Rose insists in a footnote that, quote, eunuchs are undoubtedly made by mutilation, and indeed, colonial officials generally believed that Hijras had been forcibly castrated. In Rose's entry, though, we see Hijras themselves insisting that they're impotent even before initiation, constructing a counter-narrative that in some sense they were born this way. Their identities are inherent aspects of themselves rather than outside impositions, thus legitimizing their behaviors and their selves. So, therefore, while these ethnographies are most obviously indicative of colonial attitudes, they're not entirely one-sided. Hijra agency undoubtedly shaped them, even as colonial officials sought to collect and produce objective knowledge in order to potentially criminalize them. Next slide, please. While these two ethnographies are short, they help us situate Hijras and the CTA within larger processes of criminalization, racialization, and naturalization, while also showing us the ways in which Hijras asserted their ability to comply with, reshape, and resist the colonial state. Discussion of Hijras' bodies helped to mark them out as a bounded and separate group, in turn naturalizing gender stereotypes by insinuating that only biologically different groups would cross-dress and perform. However, Crook and Rose inadvertently illuminate potentially diverging perspectives on Hijras. Crook reflects NWP officials' insistence on Hijra criminality, while Rose's observations from Punjab potentially indicate that Punjab officials didn't actually always agree that Hijras were inherently criminal. Finally, we see that in some situations, Hijras worked with ethnographers, but in others, they either refused colonial narratives of their lives and asserted their own identities, or they refused outright to provide the state with information it wanted. These entries have thus been shaped by the colonial state's prerogatives, but they've undoubtedly also been shaped by Hijra agency and self-assertion. Thank you.